Hello, I'm Bill Serban, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse.
And I'm Stephen Chu, Professor of Psychology at Stanford University.
This is the final episode of the Cognitive Challenges of Effective Teaching video series that Steve and I produced. This episode focuses on the implications of the cognitive challenge framework that we developed in video 1.
So let's start by just going over the framework briefly that we've discussed in more detail throughout the video series. The first challenge has to do with student mental mindset, which is the attitudes and beliefs that students bring to the class about the topic, how valuable it will be to them, how useful it will be, whether they can succeed in the class through their own effort. All of those factors contribute to the likelihood of their success in the class. Then second challenge, which was actually covered in the same video, is student fear and mistrust. This has to do with the student's level of anxiety or fear about the topic and how that can interfere with their learning, and also mistrust. If they believe that the teacher is there to weed out weak students, then they'll be more distrustful of the assignments that the teacher creates. But if they believe that the teacher is there to help them succeed and is assigning work that's going to help them to truly master the topic, then they'll work harder and persevere longer in the course.
Third challenge is ineffective learning strategies. We know that students employ a variety of methods to learn in your course, and that these methods vary widely in their effectiveness and efficiency. Turns out that students often prefer the least effective learning strategies. For example, students often study for exams by reading the text and reading their notes and then rereading them. So a very popular strategy is rereading. And that turns out to be, from research, that not particularly effective strategy. And especially in contrast to something like self-testing, a strategy in which an individual reads the material, puts it aside, and then tries to recall as much as they can from memory, which turns out to be much more effective. So a challenge for the teacher is to help identify and help students adopt more effective learning strategies in the course. And then in metacognition and self-regulation, I characterized metacognition as consisting of two components. First component is awareness of one's mental activity, one's learning and thinking. And the second is one's ability to regulate and control one's mental ability and regulate and learning. So you have to think of students as always being involved in a situation in which they are trying to achieve academic goals, and they are trying to monitor and evaluate their learning. And as it turns out, students aren't particularly good at evaluating their learning. In fact, many of them use criteria that are ineffective and may become overconfident, and that influences their level of understanding in the course. Another major challenge is prior knowledge. Well-established idea in cognitive research is the idea that the more you know about a topic, the easier it is to know more. So prior knowledge is the foundation on which all new knowledge is built. And students come into our courses varying in terms of how much they know about the course content and what kind of background they have, what kind of skills they have that are applicable to the course. Some students have very little background, they're seriously underprepared, and those students are going to be at a serious disadvantage compared to students with a stronger background. But I'd also like to make the point that even well-prepared students will have knowledge gaps and skills gaps that limit their learning. So teachers need to pay attention to what students know coming into their course, and probably also on a day-to-day basis. A related prior knowledge problem is inaccurate prior knowledge, more commonly called misconceptions. Students also come into our courses with faulty ideas and misconceptions about the course content and what the field is all about. Those misconceptions can get in the way of their learning the accepted concepts in the course. Now, a lot of those misconceptions are minor and get resolved on their own, but students cling to some misconceptions. They become stubbornly resistant to instruction, and teachers may need to devise strategies to refute serious misconceptions head on. And then transfer of learning refers to the application of recently learned knowledge and skills to new contexts, typically beyond the course that students learned it in. So a well-established finding through years and years of research is that although a lot of learning involves transfer, by and large, learning is very, very difficult, and unsuccessful transfer may actually be more predominant than successful transfer. Teachers need to be aware of this condition. Students may be able to transfer material in their own class, but they may have to use strategies to promote transfer of learning beyond the course to subsequent courses and even to settings outside of academia.
The last two challenges have to do with cognitive constraints that teachers need to be aware of because they will influence how quickly and how well students learn. The first constraint is the selective nature of attention, the idea that we can only pay attention to one stream of information at a time. If we're distracted from that stream, it's really going to have serious negative consequences on our learning. Or if our attention is focused on the wrong or irrelevant information, then that's obviously going to hurt our learning as well. We see this in the classroom when students are distracted by their phones or other kinds of digital devices. It really seriously affects their learning. Or when they try to multitask, studying in the presence of distractions, they think they can multitask, but actually the brain is not designed to allow us to multitask. So that is the constraint of selective attention. The second constraint is the constraint of mental effort and working memory, which are basically related to each other. Mental effort says that the constraint here is on the amount of concentration or mental effort that you have. You always have a limited amount of concentration you can focus on any problem. If you try to do too much at once, you're overwhelmed. And once you're overwhelmed, you're not going to be able to learn or problem solve very effectively. So it's very easy to overwhelm our students with too much information at a given time, and it will really undermine their learning. Another way of looking at this is in terms of the capacity limit of working memory. Working memory is our conscious short-term memory and has a very small limited capacity. If we try to keep too much information at a time in working memory, we'll start forgetting because we're going to overwhelm the limited capacity of working memory. So you can think of this constraint either in terms of a limitation of the resource of concentration or a limitation of the capacity of working memory. But either way, it's a serious constraint on how well and easily students can learn that teachers need to take into account. And then finally, not only do we have 9 challenges, but they all interact with each other. One challenge will affect other challenges. So for example, Bill talked about ineffective learning strategies. The most effective learning strategies involve desirable difficulty, which increases the amount of mental effort that students have to devote to learning. And makes it even easier for them to be overwhelmed if we ask them to try and learn too much or learn too complex information too quickly. So we have these different interactions among the different challenges. The more prior knowledge that a student has, the easier the learning of new information. So they're less likely to have a problem with the ineffective learning strategies. They're more likely to have better transfer, better metacognitive awareness.
In the remainder of the video, we'd like to talk about the implications of this framework in 3 different ways. We'd like to talk about what the framework says about the nature of teaching, what the implications are for teaching for actual classroom instruction, and the possible implications for training teachers and professional development.
So let's talk about what this says about the nature of teaching. The framework lays out the complexity of teaching, and it shows the complex skill that effective teaching really represents. Teaching is more than just presenting information. It's creating an entire environment in which all the students can learn. So you have to take into account the students' prior knowledge, their beliefs and attitudes towards the course, their trust in you, their emotional responses to the material. So teaching is much more than just simply introducing information. It is a dynamic interaction of these 9 different challenges. So it is an incredibly complex skill, and we should recognize teaching as the complex skill that it is.
Yeah, I think I'd like to make 2 more points about this. One is that this framework focuses predominantly on cognitive challenges and really doesn't address other factors involved in learning, social, emotional, and developmental factors. So we haven't even tried to address those. And then a second point would be that this framework does not specify or prescribe how to teach, but instead focuses on the challenges that a teacher will face when trying to decide how to teach most effectively.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the implications for teaching then. I think one of the strengths of the framework is that it can be used diagnostically to help teachers, guide teachers in terms of implementing whatever pedagogy they choose, whether it be like traditional lecture or it be more collaborative learning or group learning, whatever method that they choose or are comfortable with. They know they're going to have to address these 9 challenges. So we're not telling you the procedure to follow. We're saying whatever procedure you choose, you've got to make sure you address these 9 challenges. And if something goes wrong in the classroom and the students are not doing as well as you'd like, you can use this framework to diagnose what might be going wrong. Perhaps the students are overwhelmed with cognitive load, or they don't have sufficient mental effort. Perhaps they've got an improper mental mindset for learning. You can use this framework to diagnose what might be going wrong and figure out ways to address that problem. So in order to kind of show how you might use this framework, Bill and I have created a couple of examples of how we've used the framework. I'm going to let Bill start with his example, then I'm going to talk about mine.
Yeah, and I'd like to preface this example with the idea that this framework doesn't specify that we all have to go out and find still new innovative practices to use, but instead we can continue to use the practices that are most familiar to us, but as long as we start to take into account how that practice interacts with these various challenges. So I picked something that I think is a fairly common teaching strategy these days, and that's the use of practice quizzes. I'm going to talk about using practice quizzes to address the challenges of prior knowledge, misconceptions, and ineffective learning strategies. Here's how it could work. In order to get ready for class, instructors might try to identify the key prior knowledge that students need to have coming into that class period in order to make best use out of the new information. It may be 3 terms that they need to know. It may be a couple of theories. Nevertheless, the instructor can really key in on what would be a prerequisite prior knowledge for students to be able to succeed in understanding the new material. And then develop a practice quiz related to that. And that practice quiz could be just a couple of open-ended questions. If you're so inclined, you can make longer multiple choice type questions. But the way it could work in class is that before class, students do a reading assignment where they encounter these target concepts. That could be their textbook, it could be lecture notes, it could be a special reading that you give them that's 1 or 2 pages long. They then take a practice quiz and then get feedback over it. So in this very short episode where students have read something, taken a practice quiz and gotten feedback, you have done due diligence in terms of helping students increase their relevant prior knowledge, the targeted prior knowledge they need to know for that class period. You also get to look at their responses, and that may help you identify misconceptions that students have. So you will have, before class starts, some reading on their misconceptions as well as lingering knowledge gaps, misunderstandings that they have about those target concepts that can help you better prepare for the class period. And then finally, because you've used practice quizzes, you can start to encourage students to adopt self-testing as a learning strategy, especially if you're using practice quizzes routinely in class. You can start to deliberately point out how that's helping them learn and that they could use that strategy in their independent study.
I think that's a great example of how you can use the framework to target specific challenges. In this case, it's practice tests, but you could use examples in the same way, give feedback. Instead of just simply doing things for general purposes, you can design the pedagogy to address specific kinds of challenges. So I think that's a great example. I had was more general. I used the framework when we made the pivot from, at least in my case, in-person teaching to online teaching last year. I didn't just simply try to do the exact same things that I did in person in an online format. I used the challenge framework to try and design activities that would be successful in addressing the different challenges in this new learning context. So it turns out that actually trust in the teacher was really important. The students had to trust me that I was doing the things that were going to be in their best interest. And they were more willing then to be flexible and be adaptable to all the changes that were going on, because they felt like I had their best interests at heart, that I wanted to help them to succeed in terms of learning the course content. And then I had to figure out what were the best ways of helping them to develop effective learning strategies, to reinforce good metacognitive awareness. And especially important during the pandemic was the fact that a lot of their mental effort, their concentration was being drawn by other concerns, their health, their health of their family members, childcare, financial difficulties. That was taking away from their ability to concentrate on the course, and I had to take that into account. So instead of looking at the transition of simply trying to do the same thing I did in person in an online context, I used the cognitive challenge framework to adapt my teaching practices to this new framework. So that's my example of using the framework.
And then last, we'd like to talk about some of the implications for professional development and training teachers. And I think one thing that the framework has helped me justify is the belief that teaching is a really complex activity, and that it's not something that you figure out early in your career and then you're done with it, but instead developing expertise in teaching really is a career-long endeavor. And of course, with these 9 challenges, there's an enormous amount to learn about those, and many different kinds of strategies that may or may not be useful as you plan your classes.
I think the framework says that we need to start training for effective teaching very early on. Like in graduate school, we should provide a comprehensive basis of how to teach effectively for graduate students. And then we need to make a commitment for professional development, all throughout their career. And that professional development isn't just simply presenting a practice. There's nothing wrong with best practices like doing student research or using problem-based learning. What this framework says is that what we should be developing is an effective mental model on the part of teachers as to the challenges they need to address. And then we give them practices that they can use to address these particular challenges. So the focus here is not just on practices, but it's how those practices can be used to address specific cognitive challenges. And I think if we focus on the mental model as well as the practices, then that will really make professional development more effective. So this has been a video series that lays out the cognitive challenge of effective teaching. This video series is based on an article that Bill and I published in the Journal of Economic Education. If you'd like to learn more about the research basis for the challenges and more details about how to address those challenges or more resources about learning about those challenges, we invite you to read that article. Bill and I are also welcome feedback and comments and questions that you might have. Our contact information is below. We appreciate your interest and your commitment towards effective teaching. We thank you for viewing this video series. And we wish you the very best in your teaching.